A black BMW sits at a red light on Las Vegas Boulevard. Two men inside. The man in the passenger seat is 25 years old, and by the time the sun comes up, half the country will know his name, if they don't already. He's got the radio off. He's tapping his fingers on the door. The driver glances in the rearview mirror. A white Cadillac pulls up on the right side. Slow. Too slow. A window drops. An arm extends. And in the next 4 seconds, 13 rounds go into that car, and one of the most famous unsolved murders in American history begins. The passenger's name is Tupac Shakur. He will be dead in 6 days. And the man police say organized the hit? He won't be arrested for 27 years. Here's the part that should stop you cold. For almost 3 decades, this case sat frozen. No arrests, no charges, no answers. Detectives in Las Vegas, Los Angeles, and Compton chased leads that dried up, witnesses who disappeared, and a mountain of speculation that turned into a full-blown cultural industry. Documentaries, conspiracy theories, half the internet convinced they'd cracked it. Then, out of nowhere, the case broke open. Not because of a lab breakthrough, not because of new DNA, not because someone finally flipped under pressure. It broke open because the man investigators say helped plan the murder allegedly wrote about it himself, in a memoir, with his name on the cover. That's where we're going today. Inside the case against Duane "Keffe" D. Davis, the only person ever charged in the killing of Tupac Shakur, and the trial that started this week in a Las Vegas courtroom, nearly 30 years after that BMW pulled up to a red light. If you're new here, this is Daily Crime Case, and I tell real stories, sometimes with details altered to protect people still living through them, always with the goal of getting as close to the truth as possible. The record allows. If that's your thing, hit subscribe because we've got a lot of ground to cover and this one gets stranger the deeper you go. To understand why that car got shot up on the Strip, you have to understand what was happening in hip-hop in the summer of 1996, because this wasn't random, and it wasn't a robbery gone wrong. This was the byproduct of a war. On one side, Death Row Records, based in Los Angeles, run by a man named Marion Suge Knight, a name you'll hear a lot in this story. Death Row was West Coast hip-hop's biggest label, and Tupac Shakur was its brightest star. On the other side, East Coast rap, and specifically a rivalry that had curdled into something personal between Tupac and his former friend, the Notorious B.I.G. But underneath the East Coast-West Coast feud that dominated magazine covers, there was a second layer: gang affiliation. Suge Knight had ties to the Bloods, and prosecutors say Death Row's orbit had been on a collision course for months, with a set of the Crips out of Compton and Los Angeles. That's where Duane Davis comes in. Davis, who went by the street name Keffe D, has said in his own words that he was a leader in that Crip set, and his nephew was a young man named Orlando Anderson. Now here's where the timeline tightens into something almost unbearable. Hours before the shooting, Tupac and his group were at the MGM Grand for the Mike Tyson fight. On the casino floor, they crossed paths with Orlando Anderson, Davis's nephew. Surveillance cameras caught what happened next. Tupac and members of his entourage, including Suge Knight, jumped Anderson in the lobby. It was fast, it was brutal, and it was captured on tape that would later surface publicly. Anderson walked away bruised, humiliated, and according to prosecutors, that humiliation is what got Tupac killed. Because word got back to Keffe D, and in the culture Davis says he came up in, an attack like that doesn't go unanswered. A few hours later, Tupac and Suge Knight left the MGM in that black BMW, heading down Las Vegas Boulevard. Prosecutors say Davis was in the white Cadillac that pulled up beside them, that he provided the gun used in the shooting, and that the man in the back seat, believed by investigators to be his nephew Orlando Anderson, pulled the trigger. Tupac was hit 4 times. Suge Knight was only grazed. Knight floored it, made a U-turn, and got flagged down by police less than a mile from where the shooting started. Tupac was rushed into surgery. He held on for 6 days before he died on September 13th, 1996, at the age of 25. Orlando Anderson was questioned. He denied involvement. He was never charged. He was killed in an unrelated shooting in 1998, taking whatever he knew to the grave. And for the next 25 years, that's where the case stayed. Cold. Here's what almost never gets said out loud about this case, and it's worth sitting with. For a murder this famous, The actual evidence trail is almost nothing. No gun was ever recovered. The white Cadillac was never found. There was no DNA tying anyone to the scene. This was 1996, and even where forensic science existed, it wasn't being applied with the urgency a case like this demanded. No fingerprints, no forensic link of any kind, connecting a specific person to that trigger. And there's a brutal detail that made this even harder to solve. Almost everyone who was in either car that night is now dead. Orlando Anderson, the alleged shooter, dead in 1998. Other associates linked to the case over the years, dead. The pool of people who could testify to what actually happened inside that Cadillac kept shrinking year after year until it was almost gone. Suge Knight survived, and he's expected to be called as a witness in this trial. But Knight has said for decades that he heard something but saw nothing that night, which tells you how much even the one major survivor has been willing to offer investigators. So for a quarter century, Las Vegas police worked a case that had a widely known suspect pool, a widely believed motive, and almost no way to prove any of it in a courtroom. Detectives rotated in and out. The file got reopened, re-examined, occasionally reheated by a new tip or a new documentary, and then it went cold again, every time. If you've made it this far, drop a comment with one word, what you think happened in that Cadillac. I read every single one, and I want to see how this story's landing with you before we get to the part that changes everything. By the early 2000s, most true crime observers had written this case off as permanently unsolved. Not because nobody had theories. Everybody had theories, because there was no path from theory to conviction. You can believe something happened. Believing it and proving it in front of 12 strangers are two entirely different mountains to climb. And then slowly, almost accidentally, the man at the center of it all started talking. Not to a courtroom, not under oath. To the public. In 2008, Duane Davis sat down for an interview with federal investigators. He wasn't there about Tupac. The interview was tied to a separate, unrelated federal case. But according to reporting on the case, Davis talked. He allegedly discussed his knowledge of the shooting, his position in the car, what he claimed to know about who did what that night. Here's the twist that makes this case genuinely strange. Davis has since argued that interview was supposed to be protected, that there was an understanding it wouldn't be used against him in a future prosecution. Whether that holds up is now one of the central legal battles of this entire trial, and it's an issue that could shape what happens on appeal no matter which way the verdict goes. But the 2008 interview wasn't the moment that blew this case open. That came over a decade later. In 2019, Davis released a memoir. In it, by numerous accounts, he described his proximity to the murder in detail, placing himself in the vehicle, discussing the planning, talking about providing the gun. He gave interviews. He appeared in documentaries. He talked about being a Crip gang leader in Compton, about the culture of retaliation, about that night on the Strip. Publicly, on the record, seemingly without fear of consequence. What time is it there right now? Drop it in the comments. I want to know who's watching this at 2 a.m. versus who's watching on their lunch break. Think about that for a second. A case investigators couldn't crack with 25 years of police work, allegedly cracked open because the suspect wrote a book about it and sold it to the public. Why would anyone do that? That's the single most fascinating psychological thread running through this entire trial, and it's one legal analysts have pointed to directly. People who talk about crimes years after the fact are often driven by something other than fear of consequences. Ego, notoriety, the pull of finally being known as the man behind the myth, or a belief that so much time has passed that nothing can touch them anymore. But here's what almost nobody talking about this case seems to realize. The thing that makes those confessions so powerful in court isn't just that he said them. It's what happens next, when prosecutors have to turn a book tour into a murder conviction. Stick with me, because this next part is where the entire case either holds together or falls apart. By 2023, Las Vegas police had circled back with fresh eyes. They executed a search warrant at a home in Henderson, Nevada, just outside the city. Weeks later, a Clark County grand jury indicted Duane Davis on a charge of murder with use of a deadly weapon. 27 years after that BMW rolled down Las Vegas Boulevard, the only man ever formally accused in Tupac Shakur's death was in handcuffs. He pleaded not guilty, and this week, nearly 30 years to the story, jury selection began. Now here's where this case gets legally fascinating, and it's something most true crime coverage glosses right past. Prosecutors do not have to prove that Duane Davis pulled the trigger. Nevada law allows for a murder charge built on a theory of promoting and assisting gang-related violence, meaning the state's burden is to show that Davis helped orchestrate the shooting and provided the weapon used in it. It's part of gang retaliation. It's closer to a conspiracy theory of liability than a traditional, the defendant fired the gun case. That's unusual. In most murder trials, the prosecution leans on physical evidence, DNA, ballistics, fingerprints, a recovered weapon. Here, none of that exists. What the state has instead is almost the mirror image of a typical case. They're starting with the defendant's own words, his memoir, his interviews, his 2008 statements to federal investigators, and working backward to corroborate them with witness testimony, gang expert analysis, and the timeline of that night. To do that, prosecutors have assembled a witness list of roughly 200 people. Some will speak to the original 1996 investigation, some will testify about the alleged rivalry between death row records and the world Davis says he came from. Gang experts are expected to walk the jury through the hierarchy and culture that prosecutors say made retaliation for the MGM Grand altercation almost inevitable. One more for the comments. What's the weather like where you are right now? I'm curious how many climates are watching this story unfold with me tonight. The defense, meanwhile, has a different job entirely. They have to explain away their own client's words without ever putting those words fully to rest. Expect arguments that the memoir was co-written, that passages were exaggerated or sensationalized to sell books, that a man talking to a ghostwriter isn't the same as a man testifying under oath. It's an unusual defensive posture, trying to convince a jury that a defendant's own detailed, specific, on-the-record account of a murder shouldn't be trusted as truth. And looming over the entire trial is a decision the defense will have to make in real time. Do they put Duane Davis on the stand? He may be the only person who can explain, in his own voice, why he said what he said. But putting a defendant on the stand in a murder trial is one of the highest risk moves in a courtroom, and legal analysts following the case have flagged it as one of the two biggest open questions hanging over these next several weeks. The trial is expected to run 4 to 5 weeks. If convicted, Davis faces life without the possibility of parole, one of the most severe sentences on the books, reserved for exactly the kind of premeditated, gang-motivated violence prosecutors say this was. But even a conviction wouldn't necessarily close the book. There are already appellate issues stacking up before a single witness has finished testifying. The admissibility of that 2008 federal, but even a conviction wouldn't necessarily close the book. There are already appellate issues stacking up before a single witness has finished testifying. The admissibility of that 2008 federal interview, the one Davis says was supposed to stay confidential, is a live legal question that could follow this case for years, regardless of the verdict. If Davis is convicted, and that interview is later found to have been improperly used, the entire case could be sent back for a new trial. And if the jury comes back with a not guilty verdict, that doesn't necessarily mean they believe Davis had nothing to do with it. It could simply mean the prosecution building a case almost entirely out of decades-old memories, and a defendant's own public statements couldn't clear the bar of proof beyond a reasonable doubt. In a case built this way, on evidence this unconventional, that's a very real possibility. What almost everyone following this case agrees on is this: whatever the jury decides, this trial is likely to surface more concrete detail about what happened on the Las Vegas Strip that night than the public has ever had access to. For a case that's lived for 3 decades in the space between documentary speculation and internet theory, that alone would be significant for investigators, for true crime observers, and most of all, for a family that has spent almost 30 years without official answers. So here's where we're left, at the start of week 1 of a trial 3 decades in the making. 12 jurors, most of whom grew up knowing the name Tupac Shakur, are now being asked to set aside everything they think they know and judge this case on evidence alone, evidence that's stranger, thinner, and more unconventional than almost any murder trial in recent memory. A defendant whose own words may convict him, or whose own words the defense will spend 5 weeks trying to explain away. And a question that won't be answered until closing arguments. Will Duane Davis take the stand in his own defense and try to explain, face-to-face with a jury, why a man who got away with it for 27 years chose to tell the world himself? We won't know the answer for weeks, but I'll be following this one closely, because it's rare that a cold case this famous gets a real day in court, and rarer still that the reason it does is because the person accused seemingly couldn't stop talking about it. If this case pulled you in, subscribe so you don't miss where this trial goes next. I'll be covering the verdict the moment it comes down. And if you've got a theory of your own about what really happened in that Cadillac, I want to hear it. Drop it below. I'll see you in the next case.